Why does losing $100 feel so much worse than finding $100 feels good? That is not a mood, and it is not a personal weakness. It is one of the most replicated findings in the study of how people decide, and the honest answer includes a twist. The number most people have heard for how much worse a loss feels is not quite the number the fuller evidence supports. This video is for educational purposes only. It explores documented behavioral research. It is not financial advice. Always consult a qualified professional for your specific situation. Here's the starting point. In 1979, the psychologists Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper in the journal Econometrica called Prospect Theory, an analysis of decision under risk. It became one of the most cited papers in economics, and one of its central claims broke from everything standard theory assumed about how people weigh money. Classical models treated a dollar gained and a dollar lost as mirror images, equal in size and opposite in sign. Kahneman and Tversky argued that the mind does not work that way. People evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, usually the status quo, and the reaction to falling below that point is not symmetric with the reaction to rising above it. A loss registers as a sharper, more urgent event than an equivalent gain. This asymmetry is what the field now calls loss aversion, and it is a separate claim from simple risk aversion. It is not that people dislike uncertainty. It is that a loss of a given size carries more psychological weight than a gain of the identical size. Prospect theory adds one more piece that matters here. The reference point itself is not fixed. It is usually wherever you already are or wherever you expect it to be. A raise you were told to expect and then did not receive can register as a loss, even though your income never actually dropped. A price you were quoted and then had raised on you can feel like money taken away, even though you never held that lower price in your hand. The reference point moves with expectations, and whatever sits on the losing side of it gets weighted more heavily than the identical amount would if it sat on the gaining side. The same logic plays out even when nothing about a person's actual circumstances has changed at all. An athlete who wins a silver medal after being favored for gold often describes real disappointment, not because silver is a bad outcome by any objective measure, but because the expectation itself became the reference point against which the result was measured. A worker who receives the same bonus as everyone else on the team can feel shortchanged if a rumor had set the expectation higher, even though the actual number in the account is unchanged. Nothing about the money moved, only the marker it was measured against did. Now here is where it gets specific and where the honest version of this story gets more interesting than the popular one. In 1992, Tversky and Kahneman published a follow-up paper, Advances in Prospect Theory, Cumulative Representation of Uncertainty, in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, refining the original model and estimating its parameters from experimental choices. That paper produced the number most commonly repeated whenever loss aversion comes up, a loss aversion coefficient of 2.25. In plain terms, a loss was estimated to carry a little more than twice the psychological weight of an equivalent gain. That figure has circulated for more than 3 decades as close to a fixed constant of human psychology. It is not one. In 2024, the researchers Lucas Walasek, Timothy Mullett, and Neil Stewart published a meta-analysis of loss aversion in risky contexts in the Journal of Economic Psychology, pooling the available experimental estimates of this coefficient across the field. Their overall pooled estimate came out meaningfully lower than the famous 1992 figure, a loss aversion coefficient of 1.31, with a 95% confidence interval running from 1.1 to 1.53. As the authors put it directly, the confidence interval for their pooled estimate does not include the classic value of 2.25. They also reported considerable heterogeneity from study to study, meaning individual experiments varied widely around that pooled center rather than clustering tightly on one number. So the honest version of the loss aversion story is not losses hurt exactly twice as much. It is closer to this. The original highly cited estimate of a bit more than double has held up as a description of some experimental conditions. But once you average across the full body of research that has tried to measure the same thing, the typical effect looks smaller and considerably less uniform than the number that made it into 100 books and 1,000 slide decks. The asymmetry is real. Its exact size depends heavily on what is being measured, how, and for whom. Reporting the effect as a settled 2-to-1 ratio in every context is precisely the kind of confident overstatement that better evidence does not support. What the research is confident about is the direction, and one of the clearest demonstrations of it does not involve gambling odds or hypothetical payouts at all. It involves a coffee mug. In their 1991 paper Anomalies, the Endowment Effect, Loss Aversion, and Status Quo Bias, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Kahneman, along with Jack Netsch and Richard Thaler, ran a now classic experiment. Half of a group of participants were given a coffee mug. It was opened. Owners of the mug could sell it. Non-owners could try to buy one. Standard economic theory predicts that roughly half the mugs should change hands since ownership was assigned randomly and should not affect how much the object is worth to any given person. That is not what happened. The paper reports it plainly. The median owner was unwilling to sell for less than $5.25, while the median buyer was unwilling to pay more than $2.25 to $2.75. In the author's own words, median selling prices are about twice median buying prices, and volume is less than half of that expected. The instant a mug became yours, giving it up started to feel like a loss rather than a foregone gain, and that loss was priced roughly twice as high as the identical object's value looked to someone who had never held it. Nobody in that room was irrational in any everyday sense. Nobody miscounted their money or made an arithmetic mistake. The mug did not change. What changed was which side of a transaction each people were willing to accept by a meaningful multiple. Notice what the design manages to rule out. Every mug handed out was identical, and who received one was left to coin flip, not to any judgment about who wanted it more or who could afford it. There was no quality difference to defend and no private information about a defect. The only thing separating an owner from a non-owner was which side of an already completed handoff each person happened to be standing on. And that alone, with the object itself held perfectly constant, was enough to pull the price apart by roughly double. This is the same mechanism the 1979 paper described, just made physical. The moment ownership shifted, giving the mug up stopped being a foregone gain and started being an actual loss, measured against a reference point that had itself just shifted the instant the mug landed in someone's hands. Widen the lens from a coffee mug to an actual asset with real money attached, and the same asymmetry shows up in a place regulators and homeowners both care about, the housing market. Economists David Genesov and Christopher Mayer studied condominium sales in downtown Boston in the 1990s and published their from the housing market in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2001. Owners who had bought at a higher price than current market conditions supported, meaning they were facing a nominal loss on the sale, priced their homes noticeably higher than comparable sellers who were not underwater. The paper's own language describes these owners setting higher asking prices, amounting to between 25 and 35% of the gap between the unit's expected selling price and what the owner originally paid for it, and it separately reports that these same sellers showed a much lower sale before selling if they sold at all. The price is supposed to reflect what a buyer will pay today. For a seller staring at a loss relative to their own purchase price, the number in their head kept anchoring to what they once paid rather than to what the property is worth now, and buyers had no reason to care about that history at all. This is the same reference point mechanism described earlier in the video, just moved from a hypothetical scenario into a market with real closing costs and real carrying costs attached. The reference point for these sellers was not today's market. It was the number printed on their own purchase paperwork years earlier. Accepting an offer below that number meant accepting the loss in black and white, in a way that accepting a lower number than some other buyer once paid never would have. So the asking price stuck to the wrong anchor and the home sat on the market month after month waiting for a buyer who had never been told and had no reason to care what the seller once paid. That is loss aversion operating on one of the largest financial decisions most people will ever make, not a laboratory curiosity involving a mug that costs a few dollars. None of this is a claim that avoiding losses is bad strategy, or that you are broken for feeling a loss more sharply than an equivalent gain. The asymmetry evolved for reasons that likely served people well in contexts where losing a resource was genuinely more dangerous than an equivalent gain was beneficial. The relevant point for anyone spending, saving, or pricing something is narrower and more practical. Any offer, fee structure, or negotiation that can be framed as preventing a loss will tend to land harder than the same offer framed as producing an equivalent gain, and that difference in framing has nothing to do with the actual numbers involved. A fee waived feels different from a bonus paid. A price you are told you are losing, if you do not act by a deadline, lands differently than the identical price framed as a simple discount. A checkout page that tells you your card items are about to expire is invoking the same asymmetry as a countdown clock on a sale, and a subscription cancellation flow that describes what you will lose if you leave is doing the identical thing in reverse. A gym membership that frames cancellation as forfeiting a locked-in low rate is running the same script with a different backdrop. An insurance renewal notice built around a discount you will lose if you shop around is doing the identical work under a friendlier name. None of these framings need to lie about a single number to work. They only need to place the outcome on the losing side of whatever reference point you're carrying into the decision. The dollar amount does not move. The frame around it does the work. So here is a question worth sitting with honestly. Think of the last time you paid to avoid losing something, whether it was a subscription, an item in a cart, or a position you were reluctant to sell. Were you protecting something whose loss would have genuinely cost you, or were you responding to how the choice was framed rather than to what it actually contained? Leave your answer or your bet. Follow the accounting error hiding inside almost everyone's monthly subscriptions, the sunk cost trap, and why the money you have already spent keeps controlling money you have not spent yet.